Imagine building everything you ever dreamed of. The kind of life that made your parents proud, your neighbors envious, and your enemies quiet. A sprawling home on a hill, marble floors polished so bright they looked like water, black iron gates that rose like guardians, and a sense of safety you thought money could buy. But what if I told you that safety was an illusion? That no matter how much you earned, no matter how many medals hung on your wall or how many zeros sat in your bank account, there was always someone watching, always someone ready to take it all away. That's the truth millionaires never talk about. Behind the shine of Bentleys and mansions lies a shadow, lawsuits, betrayals, false friends, and power games. You think you own your life until you realize others hold the paperwork. For Marcus, a black man who rose from nothing to everything, this truth would come crashing down on a night that began like any other. The clock read just after midnight. When the pounding started, it wasn't the knock of a neighbor or the polite ring of a visitor. It was forceful, heavy, rhythmic, like a battering ram against the silence. Marcus had always been cautious. A veteran turned entrepreneur, he knew what it meant to have enemies. Success hadn't come easily. It came with scars, debt, and nights wondering if he'd survive. But nothing prepared him for the sight that awaited him when he looked through the PEEPHOLE men. Dark uniforms, badges gleaming in the dim porch light. But something felt off. Their cars weren't cruisers, just black SUVs parked sideways. On the street, their stances were too stiff, too rehearsed, like actors auditioning for a role they didn't understand. They called themselves police. They claimed they had orders to evict at midnight. Marcus's mind raced. He owned this house. Every payment cleared, every document signed. This was his fortress. But as the men barked their demands, he realized something chilling. They weren't here for justice. They were here for intimidation. And the HOA was behind it. The Homeowners Association, dressed in the polite language of community standards, had always hated Marcus's presence, his flagpole, his cars, his success. To them, he was a stain, a reminder that a man who didn't look like them, didn't talk like them, could still outshine them, so they sent fake cops. 4 shadows standing in the night, trying to break him with fear. But Marcus wasn't the kind of man who folded. His life had been a battlefield long before this mansion existed. He had survived the heat of deserts overseas, the betrayal of partners, the whispers of those who told him he'd never belong. He had faced real enemies with real weapons. So as the pounding grew louder, Marcus didn't reach for the door. He reached for the phone, and the number he dialed was at 911. It was a direct line, a line forged in blood, sweat, and trust, a line that reached men who had once fought beside him, men whose loyalty wasn't written on paper, but carved into their souls. Navy SEALs. You see, Marcus wasn't just a homeowner, he was a brother in arms to warriors who understood one truth: you never let your own fall. And that night, when the shadows pretended to be law, the real law of loyalty, brotherhood, and justice was about to descend. The fake cops thought they were knocking on the door of a helpless millionaire. What they didn't know was that they had awakened something far greater. Marcus stood at his window, watching them pace, watching them try to rattle him, watching them prepare to take what was his. And behind his calm eyes was a storm, not of fear, but of calculation. He knew the HOA wanted to break him, to make him an example. They wanted him to leave quietly, stripped of pride. But millionaires like Marcus aren't made from silence. They're forged from resistance. Every luxury in his life was born from pain. The mansion was built on nights. He slept in his car. The cars were bought with checks earned from jobs nobody else wanted. The suit in his closet was tailored with money that once paid for secondhand clothes. And now, as he stared at the imposters outside, he knew this was just another test. Another moment where his struggle would be written in silence, or shouted in defiance. The minutes crawled. Midnight stretched into an hour that felt eternal. But Marcus didn't flinch, because help was already on its way. Far away, in quiet homes scattered across the country, phones buzzed. Old brothers in arms stirred from sleep. The call wasn't about money or favors. It was about loyalty. And loyalty has no expiration date. The HOA thought it controlled the rules, but what they didn't understand was that real power doesn't come from titles, boards, or fake uniforms. It comes from people who would lay down their lives for you. The fake cops were growing restless now. They circled the SUVs, muttered among themselves. Their act was slipping, their confidence waning. They had expected fear. Instead, they found silence. And silence is louder than panic. Inside, Marcus stood tall, the same way he had when bullets rained down years ago. The same way he had when banks laughed at his loan applications. The same way he had when his success became too bright for his neighbors to ignore. He wasn't afraid. He was ready, and soon, his brothers would arrive. That night was the beginning of something none of them could have predicted. A clash not just of men, but of truths. The truth of wealth, of struggle, of loyalty, and of what it really means to defend what's yours. Because when the SEALs pulled up, the story of fake cops and HOA arrogance would explode into something no one on that quiet Suburban Street would ever forget. The knock at midnight wasn't just an eviction attempt. It was the opening act of a war. The pounding on the door hadn't stopped. It came in waves, now sharp fists, hammering against wood, followed by muffled shouts. The men outside barked orders, flashing their counterfeit badges like weapons. They wanted Marcus to fold the break, to surrender his home, not through paperwork, but through fear. But Marcus knew better. He'd seen fear before. In the desert, in the eyes of men staring at the barrel of a gun, he'd seen fear in boardrooms, too, hidden behind polished smiles, and contracts designed to bleed him dry. And he had learned one unshakable truth. Fear only works if you let it inside. So Marcus stood still, watching. Silent. His hand rested on the counter, where his phone still glowed from the call he had made. And while the fake cops thought he was cornered, they didn't realize the ground beneath them was already shifting. Because his brothers were coming. Miles away, tires tore against asphalt. Engines roared alive in the night. These weren't just any men. These were warriors who had once stormed foreign cities together, who had faced ambushes and walked out breathing. Navy SEALs, retired in title, but never in spirit. The bond between them wasn't something an HOA board or a forged badge could ever understand. It was deeper than friendship. It was survival. They had fought for each other before, and tonight would be no different. 3 SUVs cut through the darkness, headlights off, moving like shadows. Inside, men who wore no uniforms, carried no rank. But the weight of their presence was undeniable. Each one of them carried history on their shoulders, scars that told stories, and eyes that missed nothing. Back at the mansion, Marcus felt it before he heard it. The shift in the night air, the vibration under the earth. The way silence suddenly bent under the weight of power arriving. The fake cops didn't notice at first. They were too busy posturing, too busy trying to convince themselves their act was working. But then, the growl of engines grew louder. Tires crunched against the pavement, and 3 black SUVs rolled to a stop just behind their makeshift blockade. Doors opened. One by one, the men stepped out. No uniforms, no words, just presence. Broad shoulders, cold eyes. The kind of aura that made even predators hesitate. The imposters shifted uneasily. Their bravado cracked because deep down, even they could feel it. These weren't neighbors or curious onlookers. These were soldiers, wolves entering the yard. From the window, Marcus allowed himself a faint smile. This was why he had survived. This was why no amount of HOA politics could bring him down. Loyalty, not the loyalty of contracts or committees, but the kind that is written in blood, earned through fire. The leader of the CALs, a man named Carter, stepped forward. His eyes scanned the fake cops like a hawk, sizing up prey. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to flash anything. His silence alone carried the weight of authority. Evening, Carter finally said, his voice low but sharp. Problem here. The imposters stiffened. They exchanged glances. Their earlier confidence dissolved in the face of men who clearly didn't buy their act. One of them tried to speak, his words tumbling awkwardly. We're, conducting an eviction. Orders from the HOA. Carter raised an eyebrow. At midnight, the silence that followed was heavier than any weapon. Marcus knew the tide had turned, but this wasn't over. Not yet, because the imposters still believed they had power. They still believed fear could hold ground. The tallest of them stepped forward, his voice forced and shaky. You need to stand down. This is official business. If you interfere, you'll face consequences. Carter's lips curved not into a smile, but something colder. Consequences, a word he'd heard on battlefields, in negotiations, in the mouths of men who thought intimidation could bend reality. He took another step forward, his men forming a quiet wall behind him. Let me be clear, he said. You're not police, you're not officers, and you sure as hell don't belong here. So unless you want this night to end in ways you can't handle, walk away. The imposters shifted, their act was crumbling. For the first time, doubt etched across their faces. Inside the mansion, Marcus's heart steadied. He wasn't just watching a standoff, he was watching loyalty in motion. This wasn't about eviction anymore, this was about truth. About how far men would go to protect one of their own. The HOA had thought they could by fear. They had thought forged uniforms and late-night intimidation would force Marcus into submission. But what they hadn't counted on was that Marcus didn't stand alone, and in that moment, the suburban street turned into a battlefield. No bullets fired, no fists thrown, just power colliding in silence, in stares, in the weight of unspoken promises. Minutes stretched like hours. The imposters whispered among themselves, clearly shaken. They had expected an easy night, a frightened man, a quick victory, a report filed back to their puppet masters. Instead, they found themselves staring down warriors who didn't play by HOA rules. Finally, one of them muttered, "Let's go." The others hesitated. Pride clawed at them, but fear was stronger. Slowly, reluctantly, they backed away, climbing into their SUVs, their fake authority shrinking with every step. Engines sputtered, tires squealed, and within moments, they were gone. The night returned to silence. But it wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a storm that had just passed, and a warning of more to come. Carter turned to the mansion. His eyes met Marcus's through the glass. A nod passed between them. No words were needed. They had said everything long ago. In deserts, in firefights, in nights where death had been closer than life. Marcus opened the door at last. The cold air hit his skin, but it carried something else to relief. He stepped outside, standing tall under the glow of the porch light. "Appreciate you, brothers," he said quietly. Carter placed a hand on his shoulder. "This isn't over. They'll try again, and next time, they'll be smarter." Marcus nodded. He knew it was true. The HOA wouldn't stop. They would come back with papers, with lawyers, with more tricks hidden in polished language. Tonight had been intimidation. Tomorrow would be something else, but for now, the message was clear. Marcus wasn't alone, and that knowledge was worth more than every brick of his mansion, every car in his garage, every dollar in his account. That night, as the seals gathered inside, laughter broke the tension. War stories spilled, memories resurfaced. For a few hours, the mansion wasn't just a house under siege, it was a barracks again. Alive with brotherhood. But beneath the laughter, beneath the warmth of loyalty, there was an undercurrent. Everyone knew this was just the beginning. HOA had failed with shadows. Next time, they would come with light, the kind that blinds, deceives. And ENTANGLES. And Marcus would need more than loyalty, he would need strategy. The street was quiet again, but quiet doesn't always mean safe. Marcus knew it. Carter knew it. Every man in that living room knew it. The imposters hadn't acted alone. They were pawns, pieces moved across a board by someone who believed himself untouchable. And that someone sat behind the polished table of the HOA. Morning, the game had changed. The first blow came in the form of paper, a thick envelope, stuffed into Marcus's mailbox before dawn. No knock, no greeting, just words printed in ink, sharper than any knife. Violation notice, accumulated, fines, $14,250. Immediate action required. Every page stripped with legal language, terms twisted to sound final, lines bolded to scare, to corner, to cage. They accused Marcus of breaking community standards, of disrupting neighborhood harmony, of maintaining a flagpole that diminished property value. The truth, it wasn't about harmony, it wasn't about value. It was about control. And the board wanted to remind him that while he had fought off their shadows in the night, daylight belonged to them. Marcus read the papers slowly, his face unreadable. He had seen this tactic before, not from HOAs, but from corporations, from politicians, from men in suits who believed that silence was submission. But Marcus wasn't built for silence. He placed the papers on the kitchen counter. The seals, still lingering after the long night, gathered around. Carter picked up a page, scanning it with sharp eyes. Classic pressure play. Carter muttered, "They want you to bleed money before you can even think about fighting back." Another brother, Torres, leaned in. "They couldn't scare you with badges, so now they're hiding behind lawyers." Marcus nodded. "And they'll keep coming. Fines, today. Court tomorrow. They'll try to drown me in their system." The boardroom of the HOA was buzzing that same morning. A long mahogany table, 12 chairs, and at the head, Richard Hallstrom, the president. He wasn't a man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. Power sat in his posture, in the way his fingers steepled under his chin. Around him, the other board members whispered eagerly. They had heard about the failed eviction attempt, about imposters chased off by men who didn't scare easily, but Hallstrom wasn't angry. No, he was calculating. "Fear works in layers," he said coldly. "If one layer fails, we move to the next." They resisted the night. "Now we'll bury them in daylight." He tapped the stack of documents before him. Lawsuits, fines, eviction filings, weapons polished by ink and signatures. This is war by paper, and war by paper always wins. The others nodded. They didn't question him. They never did. Back at the mansion, Marcus wasn't shaken. He'd fought men who hid behind walls of sand, behind ambushes, behind armor. Now he was fighting men who hid behind contracts. Different tools, same cowardice, but one thing troubled him. This wasn't just about him anymore. The HOA's power wasn't limited to his property line. They had the ability to harass neighbors, to manipulate city officials, to smear reputations. And Marcus knew if they couldn't break him directly, they'd try to break the community around him, turn friends into enemies, turn whispers into weapons. That afternoon, whispers began. Neighbors avoided Marcus's eye. Some crossed the street rather than pass his yard. Others muttered about disruptions and bad influence. The board's narrative was spreading carefully crafted emails about Marcus endangering community harmony. Anonymous letters slipped into mailboxes, warning that his actions could lower property values. It was psychological warfare, the kind Marcus had studied in military briefings. Win the people and you control the ground, but Marcus refused to bend. That night, the brothers gathered in the study, maps and papers spread across the table like a war room. Carter leaned forward. "They're trying to isolate you, break you socially, financially, legally. If this was the battlefield, I'd call it a siege. Torres smirked. And every siege has a weakness. Marcus nodded slowly. Their strength is their paperwork, their illusion of order. But illusions crack when exposed to light. We don't fight them in the shadows anymore, we take this public. The next move shocked the board. Marcus didn't stay quiet. He spoke. Loudly he documented everything, the fake eviction, the forged badges, the fines that piled up without basis. He contacted journalists. He leaked evidence. He posted videos online. And in the span of days, the narrative began to shift. What had been whispers about a disruptive homeowner turned into headlines about HOA corruption. Local news ran stories of intimidation tactics, of veterans threatened in their own homes. Neighbors who had once crossed the street in silence now stopped to shake Marcus's hand. The board wasn't prepared for light, but Hallstrom wasn't done. In the HOA office, he stared at the news reports, jaw tightening. Around him, the other board members fidgeted nervously. Their fortress of paper was crumbling under public scrutiny. Hallstrom finally spoke. If he wants a war, we'll give him one. His eyes were cold, calculated. We've played the game of fear. We've played the game of paper. Now, we play the game of law. He lifted a new stack of documents, thicker than the last. A lawsuit, not just for fines, but for eviction. For property seizure, for breaking bylaws so twisted, so manipulated, that they would take years to untangle. This won't be about intimidation anymore, Hallstrom said. This will be about burying him alive in a courtroom. The stage was set. Marcus had survived. Forged badges. He had survived fines. He had survived whispers. But now, the battlefield shifted again. This wasn't about fists, or guns, or even loyalty. This was about patience, endurance, strategy. Because in the world of ink and signatures, victory didn't come from strength alone. It came from outlasting. And Marcus, for all his scars, knew how to endure. That night, as he stood by the flagpole in his yard, the wind tugging at the stars and stripes, Marcus whispered to himself, "They think paper will break me. But I've bled for this ground, and I don't bleed easy." The war wasn't ending, that it was only beginning. The courthouse stood tall, gray and unmoving, like a fortress built not of stone, but of rules, red tape, and ritual. Marcus had faced firefights in the desert, ambushes in jungles, and missions, where seconds decided life or death. But nothing felt quite like walking through those heavy doors, under fluorescent lights, into the hollow silence of a courtroom. Because this wasn't just about bullets or muscle anymore. This was about patience. This was about perception. This was about truth standing naked before men who sometimes cared more for order than for justice. The HOA arrived first. Richard Hallstrom led them, a tailored suit clinging to his shoulders like armor. He wasn't carrying forged badges this time. He didn't need to. His weapons were filed neatly in binders, marked with sticky notes, highlighted in red. Behind him trailed two lawyers, sharp-eyed men who lived for loopholes, whose every word was sharpened into a blade. They filled their table with folders, exhibits, paperwork stacked like walls. This wasn't a legal hearing to them, it was a stage, a chance to bury Marcus under a mountain of rules only they claimed to understand. Marcus entered quietly. No entourage, no suit, just him, broad shoulders, calm eyes, and a folder held under his arm. He wasn't there to impress. He was there to endure. But he wasn't alone. Garter sat in the back row, arms folded, Torres next to him. The other brothers scattered. Across the benches, they weren't lawyers, but their presence was heavy. Silent reminders that Marcus wasn't just one man. He carried a brotherhood, a history, a weight the HOA could never intimidate. The case began. The HOA lawyers spoke. First, their voices were sharp, rehearsed, dripping with polished confidence. "Your Honor, the defendant has violated multiple bylaws, including unauthorized construction, public nuisance, and repeated failure to comply with community standards. His actions diminish property values and destabilize neighborhood harmony. The association seeks enforcement of penalties, full payment of accrued fines, and, if necessary, removal from the premises." Every sentence was designed to sting, to paint Marcus as reckless, defiant, unfit. They spoke as though the courtroom was already theirs. Hallstrom leaned back, smug. To him, this was checkmate. Marcus rose slowly when it was his turn. No theatrics, no rehearsed speech, just a man standing straight, speaking plain. "Your Honor," he began, "they call this about harmony, about rules. But this isn't about community. This is about control." He lifted one page from his folder. A photo. It showed the imposters from that night, their fake uniforms, their forged badges glinting under porch light. "This is what they sent to my door. Not letters, not warnings. Men in fake badges, trying to take my home by force. And when that failed, they buried me in paper." The judge leaned forward, studying the photo. The gallery murmured. For the first time, the air shifted. Marcus laid out his evidence, one by one. Emails sent anonymously to neighbors. Copies of fines with dates that didn't match alleged violations. The sudden spike in penalties the very night after the failed. Piece by piece, the illusion cracked out. The HOA lawyers scrambled. They objected. They interrupted. They tried to twist Marcus's words into knots. But the more they pushed, the calmer he grew. Because Marcus knew a truth they didn't. Lies collapse under weight. Truth doesn't. Hallstrom couldn't stay silent forever. He rose, smoothing his tie, his voice calm but cutting. This man seeks to distract from the real issue. He's making baseless claims, trying to play the victim, while ignoring the fact that rules are rules. If every homeowner ignored them, we'd have chaos. Law exists for order. He refuses that order. It was clever. It was polished. It almost worked. Until Marcus spoke again. Order without justice, he said, his voice firm, is just another kind of tyranny. The words hung heavy. Even the judge paused. The days dragged on. Each session was a battle. The HOA throwing binders of bylaws, Marcus countering with photographs, testimonies, proof of harassment. Neighbors began to appear, one by one. First timidly, then louder. A mother who received an anonymous warning about letting her children play in Marcus's yard. An elderly couple who were fined after speaking kindly to him at the store. The pattern became undeniable. This wasn't about one man and a flagpole. This was about a board that ruled by fear. By the third week, the tension was visible. The lawyers looked frayed, their stacks of paper thinner, their objections weaker. Hallstrom, once calm and smug, now tapped his pen constantly, his jaw tightening with each new revelation. And Marcus, he stood the same way he had stood the first day, straight, steady, unbroken, because this wasn't about winning quickly. It was about lasting longer than the storm. The climax came in the final session. Marcus pulled out one last document. Report he had obtained through a quiet contact, a city inspector, willing to testify. The report showed that the HOA had not only targeted Marcus, but had diverted community funds illegally. Fines collected weren't going to improvements. They were going into pockets. The courtroom erupted. Gasps. Whispers. The sound of Hallstrom slamming his hand on the table. The judge banged the gavel, calling for silence. But the damage was done. The illusion was shattered. When closing statements were made, the HOA's lawyers sounded hollow. Their words no longer carried conviction. Marcus's closing was simple. I served my country to protect freedoms. Not just mine, but everyone's. A man should be able to raise a flag in his own yard without fear of men in fake badges or fines stacked higher than his roof. What they call harmony is nothing but fear. And fear has no place in a community. The room was still. Every word landed heavy. The gavel struck. The judge's ruling would come later, written, official. But everyone in that courtroom felt the balance shift. The HOA hadn't won. Their fortress of paper had cracked. And Hallstrom knew it. His eyes, once cold and certain, now burned with quiet rage. He wasn't finished. Not by far, because men like him never admit defeat. They retreat. They regroup. And then they strike again. That night, Marcus stood once more by the flagpole. The flag rippled in the wind. Unbothered, unafraid. Carter joined him, arms crossed. You know this ain't over, right? Marcus nodded. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. They wanted war. They'll get it, but not on their terms. The wind carried the flag higher, its edges snapping sharp in the dark. The courtroom battle was won, but the war for the neighborhood's soul was only beginning. The gavel may have silenced the courtroom, but outside those walls, the war only grew louder. The HOA had been embarrassed. Their lies cracked wide open. But men like Richard Hallstrom, they don't surrender. They double down. And when power starts slipping, desperation takes its place. At first, the retaliation was subtle. Marcus noticed envelopes missing from his mailbox. Notices slipped under his door in the middle of the night, unsigned, filled with threats. His trash cans knocked over. His driveway salted so the concrete would crack. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was the slow, ugly hand of a man who refused to lose. Neighbors whispered. Some grew bolder, standing by Marcus, thanking him for speaking truth in court. Others shrank back in fear, afraid of becoming the next target. The air in the neighborhood grew heavy. Every fence, every window, felt like an eye. One night, the breaking point came. Marcus woke to the sound of tires on gravel. Not one car. Several. Headlights swept across his walls. Slicing the dark, he stepped onto his porch and saw them. A convoy of trucks, men stepping out in dark clothes, masks pulled high, moving with a coordination that was too sharp to be random. They weren't there to talk. They weren't there to fine. They were there to finish with the courtroom COULDN single quotes TO. Marcus didn't flinch. He had seen this before. In other lands, under other skies. Carter was already there, slipping out. From the shadows with Torres at his side, the rest of the brothers had been keeping watch, anticipating that the HOA's pride would spill into violence. This wasn't an ambush, it was an attempt at intimidation. But intimidation doesn't work on men who have already faced death. The group marched toward the flagpole first, crowbars in hand, ropes ready. They weren't just trying to tear down steel, they were trying to tear down meaning. Marcus stepped forward. His voice was calm. Cold. Touch it, and you'll wish you hadn't. The men paused, for the first time. Hesitation flickered, because, behind Marcus, the shadows shifted. 6 figures emerged, steady, silent, every stance disciplined. SEALs don't need uniforms to be recognized. Their presence alone carries weight. The night turned electric. Richard Hallstrom himself appeared then, stepping from the largest truck. No mask, no pretense, just raw arrogance. He stared at Marcus, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with the fury of a man who thought rules made him untouchable. You don't belong here, Hallstrom hissed. You think the court saved you? You think these neighbors will thank you? You've ruined everything, and I'll make sure you regret it. Marcus didn't move, didn't blink, didn't give him the satisfaction of fear. You already lost, Marcus said simply. The standoff stretched. Crowbars tightened in fists. Knuckles went white. The air was so thick it felt like a fuse burning down to its final spark, and then it snapped. One of Hallstrom's men lunged forward, swinging at the flagpole. In that instant, the quiet ended. Carter intercepted, moving faster than the man could process. Torres disarmed another with a twist that sent metal clattering across concrete. The brothers didn't fight to destroy. They fought to neutralize. Swift, precise, controlled. The would-be wrecking crew found themselves overwhelmed before the first swing even landed clean, because discipline beats chaos. Every single time. Hallstrom shouted orders, but his men stumbled. They weren't soldiers, they were neighbors with masks and borrowed courage. And against men forged by battle, they never stood a chance. One by one, they fell back, groaning, humiliated, their crowbars scattered across the yard. Hallstrom stood alone, red-faced, seething. His pride was in shreds, his control gone. He opened his mouth to curse Marcus, but before he could, the flashing red and blue washed over the street. Police cruisers. Multiple neighbors had called, some peeking through blinds, some brave enough to step onto their porches. What they saw wasn't Marcus starting trouble. They saw an HOA president leading a mob into war. The officers spilled out, barking orders. Hands went up, weapons clattered to the ground. Statements flew like sparks, but the picture was clear. Marcus stood still, calm, unflinching. The officers recognized the difference immediately. They had seen men like Hallstrom before, puffed up, self-important, desperate to bend authority for personal gain. And they had seen men like Marcus, steady, disciplined, with the truth that needed no performance. Hallstrom was led away in cuffs, spitting curses that carried no weight anymore. His allies scattered, masks in hand, faces exposed, shame trailing. Behind them, the HOA board dissolved in the weeks that followed. Investigations revealed financial mismanagement, abuse of power, falsified fines. The empire Hallstrom built crumbled piece by piece, until nothing remained but his name whispered in contempt. And Marcus, he didn't gloat, he didn't celebrate, simply returned to the flagpole. Day after day, the flag rose higher, not as a symbol of victory over Hallstrom, but as a reminder of something deeper, that freedom, once defended, must always be defended again. Neighbors began to gather, first just a few, then more. Children played in yards without fear. Couples walked streets without looking over their shoulders. The neighborhood that had lived in silence found its voice again. Because one man stood when it mattered. Because one man refused to bend. Months later, Carter asked him quietly, "You ever think about leaving?" After all that, Marcus shook his head. His eyes stayed on the horizon, the flag waving high against the morning sun. This is home, and home ain't something you run from. It's something you fight for. The wind carried the words across the street, across the fences, across the hearts of everyone who finally felt safe again. Marcus hadn't just defended a flagpole. He had defended a community's right to stand free. And for that, his name wouldn't just be remembered, it would be honored.